Ladies and gentlemen, this is a warning. Thank you.
Carbondale, Illinois. This small city located in the southern region of the state has around 25,000 residents, making it the largest in the region, but not even in the top 100 most populous cities in Illinois. For years before the city would be incorporated, what is known as Southern Illinois University today would be chartered in 1869. SIUC has an enrollment of over 18,000 students per year, pumping the population of Carbondale up each new fall semester, creating a vastly different atmosphere than the quieter summer and holiday months. And as the population nearly doubles, so too does the danger. Crime in Carbondale is nearly double the state average, with sexual assault being over 4 times higher here than the national average. Even with these startling numbers, the amount of murders are still very low, with the FBI only reporting a single murder across most years since 1986, when data became available. Today, student housing on the SIU campus consists of numerous dorm buildings on the western side, along with several high-rises on the smaller eastern side, as the campus is bisected by Illinois Avenue. Many of these buildings would begin construction in the 1960s and 70s, as the school was growing. As with many other campuses, SIUC had seen rioting following the Kent State shootings in 1970. But by the middle of the decade, things were more subdued. Elsewhere, Vietnam was coming to an end. Richard Nixon had resigned after the Watergate scandal. A super outbreak of tornadoes had torn through the South and Midwest, causing around $600 million in damage. But in Carbondale, shortly after the new year in 1975, a terror closer to home would strike. This would be the year that not only prolific future serial killer Timothy Krajcir would be released from prison and go on to commit his first murder in nearby Cape Girardeau in a few years, but 1975 would also see another local deviant graduate to murder himself. Over the next 6 years, someone began targeting young women on campus and around town, either breaking into their apartments or abducting them to sexually assault. Sometimes he let them live. Other times, they were viciously murdered. Authorities would notice a link between the crimes almost immediately, but it would take a further 5 years for anyone to be charged in the murders. While it has been determined that not one, but 2 separate serial killers were living and stalking in the exact same neighborhood, later DNA evidence has exonerated them in at least one of their suspected murders and found a third killer. Just how many men really were behind the Carbondale Coed Killings?
Goes on in San Francisco for the man known as the Zodiac Killer.
There could be a serial killer in Chicago.
The Oakland County child killer.
Phantom killer.
Frankfurt slasher.
4 children have now been murdered.
Has killed 5 and says he's going to kill again.
15 brutally murdered young women.
The pattern is the same.
One by one.
The death count started rising.
A man in a mask robbed, tied, and stabbed them.
Strangled, stuffed in burlap bags.
It is highly unlikely that these women were murdered by separate men.
Where will the killer strike next?
Police can't answer who or why.
That's the question that we'll never know.
I don't want to live the rest of my life wondering if this person's going to be caught.
I believe that there's someone out there that has knowledge.
And he's probably still at large.
If you know our own road, you know we value our privacy. In our personal life, it's not always easy to maintain. Whether we know it or not, sites will mine our data like full name, email, health records, and more, which they will sell to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who wants to snoop. That's why we started using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows us which data brokers are selling our personal information and automatically submits opt-out requests on our behalf. This not only reduces the amount of spam you'll get, but protects against hackers who can use this information to gain access to our social media, bank accounts, and other sensitive information. Aura also provides a ton of other features bundled into one easy-to-use app at an affordable price. You get antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more without needing to bother with different apps. We all have one or more of these tools already, but not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll know how often that happens. Like 24-hour security, motion sensors, and guard dogs, Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping my info safe so I can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. Relaxing. Ruin Road values our privacy, and we also value yours. Go to aura.com/ruinroad to start a free 2-week trial, also linked below in the description. During the first 4 years of the 1970s, Carbondale had seen a total of 4 murders, 3 of which were shootings. But it would be the final weekend of January 1975 when all hell would break loose in the city. The first of 3 bodies to be found came on Sunday, January 26, when the sister of 79-year-old Carrie Lee Reischauer came to her house at 617 North Allen Street to find the retired postal worker dead during an apparent burglary. Carrie had a heart condition, and it was initially believed she had died of fear after her robber had tied her up and put a nylon stocking around her throat. But the autopsy would show she had actually suffocated from that stocking. Next, on the afternoon of the next day, police would respond to a farm field outside of town after a call of an explosion to find the burned body of 22-year-old SIU student Steven Anderson inside the passenger seat of another student's vehicle. The car had been stuck in the field for around an hour before a ruptured gas line would explode the overheated engine. Police would eventually rule this death as an accident, but not so in the final person found after this deadly weekend. On Monday the 27th, the roommate of 22-year-old Teresa Marie Clark was coming back to their off-campus apartment after a weekend trip. Today, the former Ambassador apartments have been demolished and replaced by this shopping plaza in front of Danny Street, just down the road from the mall. Teresa was attending SIUC for speech pathology on a scholarship she had won. She was an excellent student and was on the dean's list, planning to become a speech therapist after graduating to help children with speech defects. Going to the second floor to their corner apartment number 20, her roommate entered to find the living room a mess. Inside the bathroom, Teresa's body was lying in the partly filled tub. After sexually assaulting her and stabbing her in the chest, throat, and abdomen, her killer had dragged her from the living room into the bathtub, where they placed her in scalding hot water before she would finally die of her wounds. One of her breasts showed signs of mutilation, and a shirt had been thrown over her head, which had stuck to her skin as the body decomposed. A knife, bathrobe, ashtray, and camera were missing, and the coroner estimated the time of death to be the night of Saturday the 25th, sometime after she was last seen by her roommate. The back door had been pried open, and her killer had taken 2 sets of keys to lock the door behind him and then discarded them on the ground outside. Investigations were quick to discount the theory that any of these 3 murders were linked to each other, but in both Carrie and Teresa's case, links to previous crimes were examined. Carrie had been the 3rd home in the northern residential section of Carbondale to have been robbed in a similar manner over the past 6 weeks. The first was on December 15th the previous year, when an intruder broke into the home of Annie Robinson at 3 a.m. They would hit her, tie her up, and then demand to know where her money was, making off with just $60. 2 days later, just a block southwest of Carrie Reischauer's house, someone broke into the home of 55-year-old William Woodard at the corner of Oakland and Chestnut. This time, they stabbed him in the face, tied, and gagged him. No money had been taken, but a television set was found with its cord wrapped, sitting by the door. Locals would give the description of a man seen in the area as one that matched a man who robbed 80-year-old John T. Simmons at 510 North Allen the year prior, which is just 1 block south of Carrie's home. John operated a bicycle repair shop out of his house when a man in his early 20s entered, pretending to be a customer, but would steal about $35. A month and a half after the Carrie Reischauer robbery, in rural Blairsville, just northeast of Carbondale, 81-year-old Blanche Ellett was seriously beaten during a robbery. This time, police would arrest two 15-year-old boys for the crime, both of whom would confess to the robbery murder of Krajcir. Willie Jeffries Jr. and David Lee Beaver were both tried as adults and received up to 9 years prison time, but were not suspected in Teresa Clark's murder. That slaying, meanwhile, was being looked at as linked to the only non-shooting death of Carbondale that occurred thus far in the decade. It was June 18, 1974, when some children walking near the Snyder Hill Cemetery southeast of town would discover clothing, a book, and diary belonging to 14-year-old Paulette McDonough. After alerting police, a search of the area was conducted, and the girl's body was found lying near the end of a hiking trail that began by the mausoleum in the cemetery. She had been stabbed 4 times in the chest. Today, that area has been greatly developed, and an apartment complex sits on the area down the hill from Snyder Hill Cemetery. But back then, Paulette's body had lain in the summer heat for 4 days, and was too decomposed to know she had been sexually assaulted. But she was found dressed only in her cut-off blue jeans. Police noted the crime occurred less than a mile from Clark's residence. Both were stabbings, and both had, quote, sexual overtones, but they hesitated to declare a link. Paulette was known to often walk the Snyder Hill area to look at the horses at a farm at the end of the trail, and that day she had gone with 2 friends, but they had decided to turn around about halfway on the trail. Paulette continued on, where she presumably met her killer. Police would give a polygraph test to her boyfriend, but he passed and had a solid alibi. Paulette had written the newspaper regularly, such as this letter to the editor, where she told streakers to streak on just a month before her murder. But most heartbreakingly, she had placed a personal ad in the free local dollar stretcher, which was addressed to her boyfriend, as the McDonoughs had planned to move to a new home outside of Carbondale. Little did anyone know how haunting the ad would be when it ran. Residents of the northwest section told papers after the robberies they felt personally targeted. Doors previously left unlocked were bolted, and local Ace Hardware would completely sell out of door locks. Sears would also report high sales volumes, as did locksmiths. But after a 1.5 years of no incidents, tensions would ease. In July 1976, Americans across the country were focused on the bicentennial events. It was Monday, July 12th, when Christine Pretko returned to her home at 521 North Island to discover the nude body of her roommate, 24-year-old Kathleen McSherry, lying on the bathroom floor. Kathleen had just transferred to SIUC a month prior to attend summer classes and was noted as being very social. Though several sheets had been thrown into the filled tub, the girl's nude body had been left on the floor with a towel thrown on her face. She had been stabbed 10 times on the front and back, one of which pierced her heart. Though she showed signs of being molested, it was not known if she had actually been sexually assaulted. The student's cat had begun to eat parts of her corpse. Neighbors reported hearing a scream and then dogs barking around 4:30 a.m. a few nights prior, when she was believed to have been killed. The police would recognize the similarities to Clark's murder the year prior. Their primary suspect would be a former SIUC student who would take his own life in jail while awaiting trial for murdering a couple in Champaign, Illinois. But 2 months later, a new suspect would come to their attention. It was Friday, August 6, 1976, when 20-year-old Danny Dutch and 19-year-old Jerry Morgan came to the Devil's Kitchen Lake Campground south of Carbondale to spend the night. Devil's Kitchen spans 810 acres and is part of the massive 44,000 acres that make up the Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, which takes up a large section of land to the southeast of Carbondale. Around 8 p.m., a man carrying a gun approached Danny and Jerry's campsite, handcuffing them both. He would tie Danny around a tree and then threw Jerry into his truck, driving to a more secluded section of the campground where he forced her to take drugs and sexually assaulted her. After about 3 hours, he returned her to the campsite, where Danny had awoken and was screaming. When John went out to beat him with the butt of his pistol, Jerry had fled to the nearby road, where she flagged down a driver as her captors sped off. But this time, there was no question who that attacker was. Both kids knew him. It was 22-year-old John Paul Phillips. The son of Paul J. Phillips, owner of local Phillips Lathing Company, John Paul was known as the bad boy around town, with a history of arrests such as a car chase after being pulled over for drunk driving in 1973. When he was a child, his mother had a nervous breakdown and would be committed to an asylum until she passed away. Once he was an adult, John Paul would tell a psychiatrist she had sexually abused him. Though he was described as a mischievous child, it would not be until high school when he began to use drugs and get into more serious trouble, finally being expelled from Carbondale Community High School at age 16. He joined the Marines at 17 as a plea to not go to jail for assault and robbery charges, but 3 months after enlisting had been discharged for failure to adjust. He would get married to Dolores Otterson, but troubles continued, a psychiatrist labeling him antisocial in 1974. In March 1976, Phillips had been charged with attacking a 62-year-old female janitor in SIU's Parkinson building, where his father's company was working on installing acoustic ceilings. John Paul asked Grace Edwards to unlock the attic for him, but when they got up there, he grabbed her from behind and said he wouldn't hurt her if she did what he asked. Instead, Grace hit him in the face with her keys and tried to run. John Paul would knock her down the stairs, but she managed to escape and get to police. Hiding out for a few days after the Devil's Kitchen incident, Phillips would be arrested when he returned to his trailer in Carbondale and was charged with abduction and attempted murder. Investigators noted that John Paul lived in the Carbondale mobile homes, which was just north of the neighborhood where Kathleen and McSherry lived. He also lived in number 5 of the Ambassador Apartments at the time Teresa Clark was murdered. He had been questioned at that time for returning a broken knife to a department store in the nearby University Mall, his excuse being he used it to stab in his bedpost. In May 1977, Phillips would be sentenced to up to 24 years in prison for just the Devil's Kitchen attack, as no direct evidence linked him to the killings. While no more murders after his arrest seemed telling, just 1 month after he was arrested, a man wearing a stocking and brandishing a knife broke into the home of a woman on East College Street, but fled when a group of friends came over. It is worth noting that 1977 is when Timothy Krajcir would commit his first homicide in the nearby town of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. We will be doing a future episode on Krajcir, who would mostly commit his crimes in cities outside of Carbondale where he lived in a trailer, coincidentally less than 300 feet from Kathleen McSherry's home, but would kidnap several of his victims and bring them back here to sexually assault and murder before driving their bodies back to dump them in their own towns. Tim would be incarcerated between August 1979 and June 1980, and then again in 1983 for the rest of his life. In the early 2000s, as part of a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, he would confess to all of his crimes, which included dozens of sexual assaults and 9 murders, one of which is the 1982 murder of SIU co-ed Deborah Shepard at her apartment in Carbondale. His only other confessed local murder is that of Virginia Lee Whitty in Marion, Illinois in 1978. Marion is a smaller city that lies just about 25 minutes directly east of Carbondale. It was just over a year after Virginia's then still unsolved murder that another young woman similar to the Carbondale murders would be discovered. The morning of June 3, 1979, While John Paul Phillips was still incarcerated, 2 fishermen would come to the South Market Street Bridge just south of town. It was here, on what at that time was a truss structure, they would spot something horrific dangling from the west side of the bridge. Regina Oliver Costellia had separated from her husband just before the new year and was living alone with her 2-year-old son in an apartment at 102 South Park Avenue in Herrin. The night before, she dropped her kid off at her parents' home and gone to a large birthday party. Afterwards, she had gone to a Dairy Queen and then was heading back home. Shortly after midnight, she would be strangled and brought to this bridge, and her body rolled off the west side, where her arm caught and left her dangling. An autopsy would state she had not been sexually assaulted. Another person looking for fishing worms found some of her clothes nearby. An anonymous phone caller a week later informed police that he had been in the parking lot of the Bank of Herrin that night and witnessed something, but he did not provide enough details. Upon their urging, he would call again, but hung up before the lead detective could get to the phone, presumably because he was afraid of being traced. 2 years later, in April 1981, John Paul Phillips would be paroled, and Timothy Krajcir would be let out in a few months. But one more murder of a young woman would occur just before these 2 killers would be unleashed on the Little Egypt area of Southern Illinois. 37-year-old Marie Azevedo would drop off one of her kids to her daycare at 8 a.m. March 25, 1981. But never arrived to her job at the Office of Social and Community Services on the Southern Illinois University campus. It was a week later, on April 1st, when a farmer at the end of this dirt road on the outskirts of northeast Carbondale would spot her car. Inside was the body of Marie. She had been shot several times from both the left and right sides of her car. When police learned she had just finalized a painful divorce from local dentist Alan Azevedo, he was naturally their prime suspect. Though he would pass a lie detector test, 4 years later, he would be charged with hiring El Rukin gang members from Chicago to do a hit on the woman, as a judge had ruled she was able to take her 4 children with her back to their homeland of India. Alan had a contract with the Illinois Department of Corrections to do dental work on inmates at Menard Correctional, which is where he would hire them. Coincidentally, this was the same prison where Phillips and Krajcir would serve time. The gang members would testify that Alan had not paid them for the contract, but he was found innocent by insufficient evidence, as it was alleged the gang was testifying solely for immunity in the murder. 2 months after his acquittal, Alan himself would be found shot to death in his own vehicle by his 15-year-old son. Emmett Cooper, the man charged as the triggerman in Marie Azevedo's murder, would go to trial that year as well, but his case was dismissed after witnesses recanted their story. This is the Susan Shoemake Memorial Overpass. Back in 1981, it was an unofficial dirt shortcut called the Ho Chi Minh Trail that SIU students used to quickly cut between the east and west campuses that were separated by the railroad tracks in Illinois Avenue. It was August 17, 1981, when 21-year-old radio television major Susan Shoemake would use the trail to head home from her job as a sales trainee at the campus radio station WIDB in Wright Hall around 5:30 p.m. When she did not meet her friend for dinner, nor return home that night, her roommates reported her missing to campus security, and a search began. Later that evening, one officer would look in the woods off Ho Chi Minh Trail between the railroad tracks and Illinois Avenue to find Susan's body. Her pants and underwear had been taken off, and she had been sexually assaulted before being beaten on her head and then strangled to death. A shallow grave had been dug nearby, as if she was planned to be buried, but her attacker had left before he could finish. A dozen officers were stationed on the trail in the following week to question all who used the popular shortcut, but no one was able to provide any useful leads. They would also track down and question all known local sex offenders, noting that John Paul Phillips had been working in the new gymnasium being constructed on campus. He also had fresh scratch marks that he had on his face, and would give conflicting stories on how he had gotten them. But hair samples from him would not match a foreign hair found on Susan's body. It would take an entire year before the college would put up a sign telling students to not take the wooded path, but to use the official pedestrian overpass that was about 1,000 feet north. That spring, Susan's yellow backpack would finally be discovered in the muck of Piles Fork Creek between Ho Chi Minh Trail and the student dorms. The only discernible fingerprints on it would be identified as Susan's own. However, in the same area, police had found a toiletry bag that had been dropped. Inside was a prescription for Daniel Wollison, a man on parole for burglary. Daniel had gotten a job as a handyman at the Quads Apartments, and was between living in a rundown motel and in the woods near Piles Creek Fork that was directly between Ho Chi Minh Trail and the Quads. When questioned, he would provide hair samples, but when police returned, he had fled, leaving a torn-up letter behind. Police would stop looking for him when his hair also did not match the one on Susan's body. It would be November 11th, 1981 when the next murder occurred. 30-year-old Holiday Inn waitress Joan Wetherall had clocked out of her job and gone to the club bar and lounge in Carbondale until around 1:45 a.m. Unbeknownst to her, John Paul Phillips had been watching her, and as she exited through the back of the bar into the alley, he pulled her in the darkness and strangled her into unconsciousness. He would then drive his wife's car up, throw her into the trunk, and go to his father's warehouse along Route 51 north of the city. After repeatedly sexually assaulting her, Phillips told Joan that he needed to tie her hands up before he would take her back. But, angered at her insulting him, he threw a noose around her neck and struck her in the head with a hammer. Next, he would stick a hose inside the woman's cavities to wash out any evidence. As he was wrapping it in plastic on the loading dock, he would yet again sexually assault her corpse. Finally, he drove about 25 minutes north to the lonely blacktop road that runs between Vergennes, Elkville, and then ends just before Royalton, Illinois. A few miles outside of Elkville, he would try to submerge her body in waters at an abandoned strip mine, but could not, so he left her floating. The following morning, a couple coming to fish here would spot her body. Joan's family and friends pledged to solve her murder and began investigating and searching the area on their own. Joan had a fiancé who was working in California at the time, and his company would put up a $10,000 reward for information. In December that year, partially burnt items belonging to Joan would be found in the rest area of the Crab Orchard Lake area, and police would search the surrounding land but didn't turn up anything else. Little did they know, in less than 2 months, they would apprehend her killer. Just on the other side of Crab Orchard Lake, in the small city of Carterville, a 22-year-old woman was walking along Virginia Avenue to the bank on Main Street when a man stopped and asked her where the pastor of the church on the corner lived. She said she didn't know and continued on her way. After going to the bank and coming back, she was approaching that same intersection when the man would rush up and grab her from behind, holding a knife to her throat. He said if she fought him, he would stab her. But as he tried to get her into the truck, she was able to knee him in the groin and fled a block south to the police station. John Paul Phillips would be arrested for this, as well as an abduction he had committed the month prior in Carbondale. where he grabbed a foreign exchange student on December 26 as she was about to borrow a friend's car from their house behind Gatsby's Tavern when Phillips shoved her inside and drove to his father's warehouse, holding a knife to her throat before tying a cloth around her head. As she did not fight him during the sexual assault in the warehouse, his twisted mind thought she liked him, so he would allow her to live and dropped her back off in Carbondale. For these two crimes, John Paul Phillips would be convicted of 45 years jail time. The November 1983 murder of 27-year-old Terry Lynn Fasel would initially make many fear the killer had returned. A hunter would discover her body at the bottom of a ravine near the Sahara mine about 13 miles east of Marion, partially buried by debris. Less than 2 months later, Terry's ex-husband would hang himself in the jail cell after unlicensed guns were found in his possession. Though detectives say they did consider him a suspect, they had no proof, and her case has never been solved. After that, no more similar murders of young women in the Little Egypt area of Lower Illinois would go unsolved. One day, police would learn why, when the cellmate of John Paul Phillips would say he had information to give. Thomas Mockabee was similar to John Paul in some ways. Since his youth, he had been the bad boy of Marion, first being arrested at the age of 17 in 1980 when he would make harassing phone calls to a girl and then destroy her mailbox and steal some letters. 2 years later, he would threaten employees with a knife at Gatsby's Tavern in Carbondale when they refused to return his fake ID. His current arrest was for a May 1983 incident where he got into several altercations before jumping into the car of a woman and refusing to let her out until he finally surrendered to police. One day, John Paul would be moved into Mockabee's cell. He described John as babbling psychotically, laughing how he had killed 3 women, and name-dropping Clark, McSherry, and Wetherall. When detectives asked why he would label himself as a snitch to give them this information, Mockabee stated he had his own daughter who would be grown up one day, and he didn't want her walking out of the back of a wrong bar into the hands of someone like John Paul Phillips. In 1986, police would officially charge John Paul with just the murder of Joan Wetherall, and the circus event trial would begin. Joan's family, who had always been outspoken about her death, would get in trouble several times for purposely spilling soda on John's father and making obscene gestures towards John. John Paul, meanwhile, was also acting up, quarreling with his lawyers and complaining of his seating during the trial. On October 9, 1986, John Paul Phillips would be found guilty of the murder of Joan Wetherall, but innocent in the 1981 sexual assault. The next month, during his sentencing hearing, as Thomas Mockabee was testifying yet again, John Paul would pull out a homemade zip gun he had smuggled into the courtroom in an attempt to shoot Thomas on the stand. But the gun misfired. He then threw it at Mockabee and tried to rush him before his defense attorney grabbed him. When the ordeal was over, Phillips' father would applaud his son's actions. Upon hearing he would receive the death penalty, Phillips would state he had no remorse, hoping Joan had felt everything and then spit on the prosecutor. The next year, when he was back in court for the attempted murder of Mockabee, Phillips had to be physically carried into the courthouse, stating, "They took away the cross I was wearing, so I figured I'd let them carry the whole burden." He would later be thrown out of the courtroom after a profanity-laced outburst. Even in prison, Phillips wouldn't settle down. In August 1987, he would get in a fight with Harry Brisbane, a man known as the I-57 killer who bashed John Paul's head with a set of weights. In 1988, Phillips was one of 3 inmates who barricaded themselves inside a rec room and set fire to it, causing over 25 people to be injured in their riot over demanding a radio and more recreation time, and earning him another 60-year sentence. Finally, on November 2, 1993, Phillips would die of a heart attack on death row. Though he never publicly confessed to his crimes, a psychiatrist would state he did admit to them during a session. Though he had been drinking and on drugs during the murders, he said that was not why he had committed them. Instead saying, "I don't know the cause of my behavior. I'll die with that mystery." Thomas Mockabee would be paroled in 1988. He said that John had told him he hated women, and that as a kid he had gotten in car chases with police for the thrill of the pursuit, which he then got from murdering women and watching police hunt for their killer. He also confessed that he would return to the crime scenes to watch the women decompose, even drinking some of McSherry's beers and hanging out in the house. Phillips would also state he had killed an African-American man while he was down in Louisiana for work, shooting him in the face behind a rest stop. In 1990, Mockabee would die in a motorcycle accident while drunk driving. In 1988, Southern Illinois University would build this footbridge to replace the Ho Chi Minh Trail after Susan Shoemake's father had sued them and the railroad company for $2.11 million, holding them negligent for not maintaining the path or advising students to not use it. It would soon be renamed the Susan Shoemake Memorial Overpass in her honor. In 2001, John Paul's body was exhumed and DNA was extracted from his femur bone to be run against DNA found on Susan Shoemake's body. It did not match. Detectives would track down Daniel Woolison, who was now living outside Detroit, Michigan, and ask him to provide a DNA sample, which he refused. They would keep tabs on him, and when he sold a car, detectives asked the new owner if they could search it, recovering Daniel's cigarette butts he had left in the ashtray. DNA on those butts would match that found on Susan Shoemake, and in 2004 he would be arrested and received a 20-year sentence for her murder. In 2023, Daniel was released on early parole, but would die of an overdose in September 2024. Back in 2008, DNA in Kathleen McSherry's case was run and would confirm John Paul Phillips as her killer. That same year, DNA on Regina Costellia was tested but turned out to be her own. There is no evidence that suggests John Paul, Daniel Woolison, or Timothy Krajcir ever knew each other, despite their murderous paths coming literally within hundreds of feet of each other. With every new semester, memories of the fearful years of Carbondale was stalked by at least 2 serial killers fades further into the memory, as screams in the night are replaced by screams of cheers in the Saluki football stadium. But for the family and friends of the women who never got to graduate, no amount of time will ever numb the absence of their daughter, their sister, their student, taken by a system that released dangerous men on the streets after receiving an education in crime, not once, but multiple times. While Carbondale gives the appearance of a nice college town, doors are still bolted at night. After all, you can never really tell what evil is lurking just around the block.